Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Florence Guedas from the International Agency Nantes-Saint-Nazaire, and I am very excited to welcome Jeffrey Schnapp here in Nantes. Jeffrey Schnapp is an historian and a professor of Romance languages and literature. He teaches at the Department of Architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He is also the founder of Meta Lab, a research project on internet culture in the arts and humanities. Now, some words about his research interest. Jeffrey Schnapp is known for his work about crowds and won a prize for a book on this topic. He also played a pioneering role in digital humanities. Digital humanities is an area of research concerned with the intersection of computing and the humanities, from curating online collections to analyzing large cultural data sets. Recently, he wrote a lot about knowledge design and organization of knowledge in libraries, museums, and collections of images and texts. Today, he will present us, for the first time in the world, a preview of a web documentary entitled Cold Storage. Cold storage is an extension of a printed book called The Library Beyond the Book. So please welcome Jeffrey Schnapp.
Thank you very much for that introduction. If I weren't suffering from having arrived this morning directly from the airport, I might give this talk in French. So for purposes of le débat, la discussion, on peut poser des questions en français, mais je vais présenter quand même ma communication en anglais. Labels and titles are rarely things that we choose for ourselves. They almost always are things that get assigned to us. And the label digital humanities is a phrase that has come to become associated with a wide array of practices, not necessarily a cohesive set of practices. And like all labels, it has both strengths and it has weaknesses. And what I wanted to start to do here by way of an introduction to the cold storage project that will be the focus of my remarks is really to frame that project in relation to a series of issues that have characterized at least my version of digital humanities. And I thought for purposes of self-disclosure, I should say that I have always had an uneasy relationship to the label digital humanities. Digital humanities comes along as a label at the end of a long genealogy of crisscrossings between computation and the arts and humanities fields. There's been many labels that have come before it, like computing in the humanities, what used to be called humanities computing, computers in the humanities, humanities informatics. And digital humanities comes along really roughly coincident with the rise of the personal computing revolution combined with the emergence of the internet as the defining public space of our time. My own hesitations about the label are twofold. The word digital, which I don't like, and the word humanities, which I don't like either. I don't like digital because a lot of the most exciting and transformative opportunities in the collision between the computational world and the arts and humanities fields involve reimagining the analog world. They involve aspects that don't give agency to the digital as if it's the transforming power that, that opens up new avenues, that opens up possibilities for innovation, new kinds of audiences, new forms of practice. But of course, however central they are, nonetheless, it's the meshing between culture and society and digital technologies that actually produces the magic. It isn't the digital per se. The word humanities bothers me just as much to the degree that many of the most exciting experimental areas of research are areas that involve, if you like, an expansion of the boundaries of the traditional human sciences in ways so as to render essentially null and void traditional taxonomical distinctions between the human sciences, the social sciences, the fields of engineering and the natural sciences. The areas that interest me are almost always areas that blur those boundaries, and therefore I'm not willing, as a matter of principle, to give up on the notion that digital humanities should be something much more than humanities and much more than digital. So I like to talk about knowledge design instead, as the task that labs like MetaLab at Harvard or the Stanford Humanities Lab, which I ran at Stanford from 1999 to 2009. What I like about knowledge design is that it suggests that many of the key challenges that we have available to us today in this ongoing conversation between computational methodologies, digital media, and the arts and humanities fields really involve questions of design, questions of reimagining the analog world, reimagining, reprogramming, in a sense, our relationship to the physical world, opening up new kinds of social, cultural, and other possibilities, thinking and telling stories on scales that are not part of the human record until the rise of these kinds of technologies. So under the rubric of knowledge design, I like to put this broad array of elements, and I'm not going to go through this entire list here, but that in my view at least characterize the wing of digital humanities practice that has interested me and my collaborators. And some of these elements involve really rethinking basic practices of labor, of the way intellectual inquiry takes place, the kind of community, the kinds of institutional frameworks within which it takes place. They include an increasing interest and commitment to co-creative process, to collaboration and teamwork. Not by chance, MetaLab is called a lab, and by lab, what we mean above all is a notion of practice that is collaborative in many of the same ways that a natural science laboratory is. A second area that will certainly be a centerpiece of what I'm going to present to you today is trying to think about a world where knowledge equals process, not product. That might seem like a simple distinction, but it's actually one that has created a certain complexity because, at least in the arts and humanities fields, particularly in the humanities fields, the overpowering role that print has played in shaping ideas about what knowledge looks like, literally looks like, how it is designed, how it tells stories, the scale on which scholarship communicates, methods of validation and evaluation. All of those are deeply rooted in the history, particularly of the industrialization of print. And one of the things that the digital does to that world is really to take us away from the timeline, the kind of temporality, the kind of phenomenology of print as a medium, into a world where print now coexists with a whole series of other media possibilities, other channels to communicate. And those channels are engaged in a very rich and rather fluid dialogue, but it's one that really applies pressure to print as the sort of final word, so to speak, as the final arbiter of authority. And I'm very interested in this whole issue of how we reimagine print in a kind of archipelago of media relations, where now process is the focus, not product, and where print has defined a place in timelines that have a kind of fluidity and extensibility that we don't associate with traditional approaches to humanistic knowledge. A third area, which I think is perhaps self-evident but maybe worth underscoring all the same, is that our very notion of what counts as cultural, as the cultural record or as knowledge, for example, has itself undergone a massive extension over the course of the digital decades, particularly the rise of visualization tools as modes of argument, as ways of translating very large and complex data sets into arguments. And visualization is a craft. It is not simply a kind of industrial practice that we can carry over into human practice in the human sciences without becoming profoundly engaged in transforming it. But it certainly plays a role that I think opens up some rich and exciting possibilities. and certainly gives rise to new challenges. A second area, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in, is this whole problem of capturing, preserving, and studying the cultural phenomena that the era of print, which of course is an era that's lasted 5 centuries, could only weakly document. Namely, for instance, performance-based models of culture, the acoustical record of human culture, sound, taste, smell, movement, anything that doesn't readily lend itself to print-based models of scholarship. I mean, it suffices just to think about the fact that until the end of the 19th century, the entire soundtrack of human culture is lost. We only have traces of it. We have fragments of it. I'm a medievalist by training, and we know that medieval culture was particularly rich in performance-based modes of culture, and yet of that, we have only the traces that have made their way into manuscripts, basically. So this opens up a whole set of fields, but also a whole set of questions about what an edition of a sound artifact looks like, about what it is to communicate arguments that are made in media that are not, for instance, textual. And I think it's a universe that is one rich with opportunities for experimentation, and that's why I'm excited about it. The third point I want to make here is that I think the very notion of scholarship is undergoing, under this umbrella of what I was calling knowledge design, or what we could call digital humanities, a kind of extension of its sensorium. In other words, a kind of expansion of what it means to convey knowledge that includes the idea of the experiential, that isn't just about the mental, but includes areas of practice that go beyond simply textual, text-based models of evidence, argument, and so forth. I've alluded to design, and what I mean by design is really a set of translational practices that are focused, above all, on grappling with this entire issue of what knowledge looks like today. And I mean that quite literally, as I'm going to say in a minute. Some other themes here, again, I'm not going to go through all of these seriatim. Curation as a practice is itself a scholarly practice, not some kind of practice that happens outside of the academy in museums and archives and libraries, but rather that's inside the world of research and scholarship. We see some very interesting models emerging where scholarly argument is made through the construction of corpora, of full corpora, and their presentation, often in a tool-rich environment. The focus of much of what I'm going to say is multi-channeling. This question of what publishing looks like today, the moments, the kind of phenomenology and chronology of publishing moments, and the ways in which we could think, I think, in an experimental way, in a playful, in an imaginative and innovative way, about what a world of communication might look like, where high-level scholarly practice speaks along multiple channels to multiple audiences. Last but not least, new models of training, a focus on collaboration that also includes the possibility for leveraging the power of the community itself, of different research communities, but also society at large, to become involved in processes of inquiry, and public knowledge, a great theme of the digital humanities. Now, even though I complained about the label digital humanities, I've written a book that's entitled Digital_Humanities with 4 colleagues of mine. And this book was an attempt, first of all, to create a different kind of scholarly book. I'm not going to be able to show this to you today, but you'll see that the apparatus for the book is itself a graphical interface, if you like, an experiment with how we could reimagine what a book looks like in the digital age. And what the book does is basically tries to map the overall terrain of the shifts that have been happening in the human sciences. And its central chapter, chapter 2, goes forward to expose a whole series of hypotheses for the different shapes, the different forms that knowledge is increasingly taking today. In other words, it is, as I would describe it, a kind of exercise in knowledge design focused on a number of genres. Those genres include new practices of curation. They include models, new concepts of what an edition looks like. They include questions of work with large textual data as well as other kinds of data, cataloging data, for example. They include new kind of zoomable models of argument in the cultural fields that move between microanalysis and macroanalysis. They include the use of analytical tools, particularly data mining tools, to tell stories at a very large scale about the human record or about the history of media or whatever the argument in question may be. They include experiments with mapping. Mapping has become a central feature of a lot of the most rich experimental work in the domain of, broadly understood, of the digital humanities. And they include, in particular, this is an area that the Humanities Lab at Stanford, but MetaLab even more so, have been deeply committed to, which is what I like to call the animation of archives. How do we go beyond our kind of traditional storage-based concept of what an archive is and start to think of archives as places where we do things rather than where we store information? And this will be pertinent to what I say today. Among some of the other fields, we have the emergence of gaming, of different kinds of simulation-based and gaming-type strategies for both argument and discovery. We have code studies. We have a kind of remix culture that's underway. You're going to get a little taste of that this afternoon, and so on and so forth. Now, the area that I want to focus on for purposes of this presentation is one of those genres, and it's a genre that MetaLab has been very actively involved in. We have 2 such projects underway right now, and it's what is sometimes referred to as a database documentary. The database documentary is it's a form of storytelling and argument that, in a sense, brings together the tradition of the documentary cinema, but it brings that tradition into the archive. And a lot of the material that you would have in a conventional documentary, as I'm sure many of you know, at least intuitively, 95% of the footage ends up on the floor by the time that you get to a final cut of a documentary. All of the research, all of the different elements that typically would make up the elaboration of a full, mature documentary project, those materials are pushed to the side in favor of a particular slice through those materials, a particular thread, a particular way of engaging with those materials. You can only tell one story or a story or two. The difference with database documentaries is that they are literally built around databases, and that there's the possibility to create an extraordinarily dense and rich layering of information and materials, and to build an interface, a structure that allows end users to decide which is the trajectory through the path, the most interesting path, the most seductive path, the most confusing path, whatever that path may be. It places those reins, those navigational skills in the hands of users. In other words, it's communities of users who actually activate database documentaries instead of a director and a producer. Temporal sequence, duration, sound levels, the presence or absence of elements of a critical apparatus, all of those elements that in a traditional documentary are resolved and packaged for a viewer, in a database documentary are in the hands of an end user. Which is to say that in the context of database documentaries, we can also think about a model of the documentary that tries to balance the exigencies of telling a single story or a small network of stories, and the possibility of a user population that bounces between those normative stories and an almost infinite set of combinations of stories that may not have been anticipated in the design of the database documentary itself. In short, the database documentary is a kind of attempt to bring together the world of the archive and the world of storytelling, which is, of course, the fundamental feature of the world of human culture itself. We're working right now on 2 such database documentaries, the one I'm presenting today, which is called Cold Storage, and another one which is about an arboretum, a collection of trees, of 5,000 trees. It's the Arnold Arboretum, which is an experimental park at Harvard University that has a complete archive from the moment of its creation to the present, with every single tree in the park that ever existed, whether it's alive today or not, fully documented, every moment, where it came from, its growth, every phase of its transformation, of its life and death documented. So we're really interested in this whole problem of telling stories that have very complex models of, if you like, action, that are, in a sense, collective actions. The story of 5,000 trees woven together into the story of how an artificial landscape is created where they can grow together and join into families and tell stories about botany and about the evolution of the sciences. Okay, so without further ado, I mentioned that the database documentary is a genre that's been emerging over the course of the last decade or two. There's some really fantastic projects. If you're curious to see other examples, I'm only going to be able to show you some snippets of what we're still developing at MetaLab in the case of cold storage. But two examples that I would recommend, if you're curious about them, are Bear 71, which is a project that the Film Board of Canada funded that tracks the life of a bear as part of a research project in an interactive way. I think it's a really beautifully crafted interpretation of the genre of the database documentary. And another one, which is an artist project called Begin the Whale Hunt, which was a project that was done almost 10 years ago, but I think it's still a very compelling example of the possibilities. So now let's turn to cold storage, which is a different kind of database documentary than the ones that I just alluded to, which are more, I think, oriented towards the artistic, expressive end of the spectrum and less towards the archival end of the spectrum. And cold storage is somewhere in between. First of all, it is an experiment in knowledge design in the most literal sense, that it brings together a design studio, which I've been running for the last 2 years with some colleagues, called Library Test Kitchen. I'll say more about Library Test Kitchen in a minute, but I think the name already suggests something about its ambitions. It's a kitchen where we cook stuff up, sometimes crazy stuff. It's also a coda to an experimental book. It's a chapter of a book turned into a database documentary with, as you'll see, a documentary in the middle of it, a traditional documentary. Third of all, it's the object of a design studio, more recent than Library Test Kitchen, which was dedicated specifically to doing an experiment in what we in MetaLab sometimes like to call institutional portraiture. Sometimes we like to call it data portraiture. That is, to try to experiment with what it means to tell a story about an institution, how to document its practices today, when every institution has, not every institution, but almost all institutions, in some deep sense, the true facade that faces out into the world is their internet portal, not their physical facade. So in that kind of world, what does it mean to represent or to describe that institution? Fourth, it's a database documentary, as I was suggesting. The cumulus, if you like, of all of these different efforts to excavate, narrate, create an archive around an institution. And fourth of all, what I'm going to conclude with here today, it's a documentary film. But it's a documentary film that is itself a reworking and an updating of another film, Alain René's 1957 Toute la mémoire du monde, the film in which René, working with Chris Marker, rather lovingly reconstructs the history, the present of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. So let me go through those layers and then I'll lead us towards looking through various aspects of cold storage. So first of all, cold storage began as a component within a design studio at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard called Library Test Kitchen. The Library Test Kitchen was an attempt to create a space for speculative design practice around knowledge spaces. Knowledge spaces, of course, mean a great many things. They include classrooms, they include different kinds of civic spaces, but of course they above all include libraries. And much of the conversation about libraries, about whether libraries will be here, 50 years from now, like the hyper feverish techno-utopians have libraries on their extinction timeline. In other words, like 30 years out, the last library is closed. And on the other side, of course, there's professional librarians who have developed tremendous skills and practices that are fundamental to the way we access knowledge, we engage with knowledge, we share knowledge, and we produce new knowledge, who are anxiously sitting around scratching their heads trying to think about what being a librarian means today. And even in addition to them, we have architects who have to design such physical spaces and struggle with the question of how do we create a rich interaction between this world filled with media and with information and the reality that much of that information interacts with analog type artifacts and will continue to. We're printing more books today than we have ever printed in the history of humankind at the height of the digital era. Yet there's a tremendous overlap between knowledge that's being produced in the analog and digital channels. What do we do with that kind of complexity? Well, those are the kinds of questions we were interested in and that Library Test Kitchen was involved in, getting a design community thinking propositionally and speculatively and practicing those propositions and speculations in the form of actual designs that are tested out in actual libraries. So that was one of the first places that Library Test Kitchen, Cold Storage began. The second is as the coda to an experimental book, The Library Beyond the Book. This is a book that I have a copy of right here, and as you'll see, it's a rather unconventional book in a couple of ways, but I'm going to save that for a minute from now. Among them, that the provocations that run along the margin, the top of the book, are actually a card deck as well that you can play. You can play, depends on the game you want to play. Do you want to play Library Futures or do you want to play Bridge or a conventional card game? You can do both. But the point is that we wanted to create a sense of a book at the center of a network of different kinds of channels in ways that would be productive to creating a different kind of community conversation about the future of present and future of libraries. The third is the design studio that I mentioned that was specifically dedicated to the theme of institutional portraiture. And that was a course that I taught with the MetaLab team just this last spring, where a group of students from a variety of different schools, from the education school to the arts and sciences to the School of Design and Engineering, all dug into one form, one aspect or another, excavated in a sense, materials concerned with the Harvard Depository, which is the object of cold storage, in order to create a kind of experiment with what it might be like to create a kind of comprehensive portrait of this institution, about which I'm going to say more in a moment. And that portrait includes excavating data, the way it produces data flows. It serves as a node in a system of data exchange that extends throughout the Harvard campus, but also far beyond, across the world, but also the kinds of records that are found in archives, the kinds of records that are found in the memories of those who work in the facility, those who remember changes in policy, those who have experienced it in one form or another. A database documentary was the end result that we were working towards building a kind of library of materials for. And as I said, those materials include everything from traditional archives to living archives, if you like, in the sense of the study of data flows. And last but not least, we have the documentary, which is a reprise, a rewriting, reworking of one of the classic library films of the 20th century, the mid-20th century, René's Toute la mémoire du monde. And I'm going to close this talk by presenting to you, whoops, there you have the very dramatic music that it begins with. I'm going to close this talk by presenting the 15 minutes of our documentary, but keep in mind the René if you don't have it fresh in your memory. I highly recommend it. It's a spectacular film. It's also a film that's engaged in a very playful game of self-reference, much like our film will be too. Now, all of these elements, this complex weave of stuff, is threaded together through a website, which serves as a support. It's a placeholder website for the moment, but it's really built around a set of core questions. And these are the questions that cold storage, in a kind of deep sense, tries to answer. What kind of place is a database? How do the normativity and pervasiveness of databases as information storage, retrieval, and production environments enable certain kinds of spatial arrangements and architectures, and of course the opposite? How do certain spatial arrangements and architectures enable databases? Third question, what is the history of such architectures? What's the history of database architecture understood in both the spatial and the informatic sense? And where do such architectures come from, and where are they going? Those are really the core questions of this project, which uses the Harvard Depository as an object to tell a bigger story, much like Alain René uses the Bibliothèque Nationale de France to tell a bigger story about storage, information, the culture of knowledge. So from ancient Pergamon to the present, libraries have been built metonyms for smart spaces. Never mere storehouses of information, they were and remain sites for gathering, reading, teaching, and conversation, places of communion between past and present, spaces of retreat that enable sustained modes of engagement. They have also been places where the mind meets the hand and process meets product, where the task of shaping words and thought interact with modes of physical making associated with the arts of reading and writing and copying, of course, which is an abiding feature of these structures. Most of all, they have always been places, physical environments, where knowledge is navigated and activated under distinctive, unique, even eccentric spatial conditions that infuse the knowledge forms produced therein. From the outset, the library's ontology has been loop-like, animated by a community of readers. The biblioteca is at once edifice and bookcase, container and the thing contained. Once temples reserved for a chosen few, this is the Morgan Library in New York, which is a kind of copy of a princely library, libraries underwent a massive democratization in the modern era. The transformation was driven by growing public literacy and the industrialization of printing, with the resulting explosion in printed records of diverse sorts. The size, scale, and structure of libraries shifted to address new needs. And in the process, the library became the knowledge factory of our collective imagination today, a vast storage container for printed matter, organized around a standardized universal classification system flanked by a battery of support structures. And you're looking here at a slide of the Bodleian, but this is the Bodleian as we imagine it because it was the early structure. But now the reality of the Bodleian is a storage structure like the one I'm going to show you in the context of cold storage. The definition is crystallized by architectures like those of the New York Public Library or the Library of Congress. This is a diagram of that, where the stack system serves as a structural support for the edifice. When New York Public Library was under construction, it was this load-bearing system of shelving, along with the sheer volume of books, that elicited the wonderment of contemporary observers. Here was the People's Palace as a princely collection, an abode literally built out of 1 million books, at once a monument to the explosive growth of print culture and a sublime emblem of social and technological progress. This is a cartoon that was published at the time, and literally people came to watch the construction of the shelving system at New York Public as a spectacle, because it was thought to be such a kind of magical feature of the library. The information age began eroding the modern library's walls right from the start. First, it displaced physical card catalogs with digital catalogs, and these migrated onto networks. Catalogs merged with other catalogs within distributed systems, becoming accessible from multiple sites. Next came proprietary databases made of leased data assets, whose increasing significance accelerated the transformation of stack-centric libraries into data centers filled not just with books, now organized along the lines of a universal taxonomical scheme, but also with the dreary digital doubles of analog reading rooms. We've all experienced some version of these, but I think of them as a kind of curse of contemporary library architecture, the workstation cluster. Once limited to local area networks serving up strictly local digital catalogs stored on institutional servers, these dumb terminals, of course, evolved into smart terminals, tethered to the World Wide Web, and the floodgates opened. In came a deluge of unfiltered information, and with it doubts about where a library begins and where it ends, about the role of physical holdings rather than services and activities, as the foundation stone of a library's sense of self. This identity crisis has come to a head with the increasing migration of documents to digital form, with the ubiquity of wireless networks and the exponential growth of online libraries, archives, collections, tools, and repositories. The database has invaded the library, and the library the database. Now both are everywhere, from the tips of every man's fingers to neoclassical temples of learning. So what kind of physical space should a library be today? Should libraries become mere access points to the world of information? Should they instead become hyper-local, emphasizing service to local communities and local forms of knowledge? Or as some have argued, should they expand their reach to encompass not just mental, but also physical forms of making? Moreover, what kind of place is a database? Is a database a place at all? And how might databases reshape our sense of place, given that navigation online and in the physical world are becoming synchronous activities? Considering that a majority of the world's knowledge is location-based, considering the key role that place and space play in human culture, a library, equipped only with an infinitely portable virtual architectonics, no matter how replete, complete, and user-friendly, may prove deficient from a sociocultural standpoint. Interactions forged within even the best designed user-centric data environments, I'm going to show you an example of one, made by my colleagues at the Harvard Library Innovation Lab, tend to pale in comparison with the significance of those forged face-to-face and on-site. So how, in the absence of a physical plant, can heroic enterprises like the Digital Public Library of America or Europeana go beyond their mission to conjoin collections on a massive scale and aim to build a shared community? Can they link local realities to the global mainstream in ways that add value to both ends of the data pipeline? How can meaningful bridges be built between existing physical infrastructures like those provided by brick and mortar civic spaces in the public library system, for instance, and how can we link these and make in a productive way to our shimmering global databases? These questions are embedded in a deeper conundrum that informs some of the most pressing design challenges of our day, namely the problem of weaving together information and space in non-trivial, even transformative ways. There's a great deal of talk today about smart spaces. And as you can see, not just smart spaces, smart everything, smart classrooms, smart cities, smart living, smart education. And the leveraging of the data assets to smarten up features of the built environment is indeed beginning to yield some significant outcomes in the case of traffic systems or certain aspects of the urban landscape, as I'm sure Carlo Ratti will will be talking about in the course of this his presentation here. But how smart are the complex environments dedicated to learning and knowledge acquisition? Perhaps by focusing on the redesign of such environments, we can model the sort of networked world we'd ideally like to inhabit, a world, for instance, in which information isn't just reducible to practicalities, to entertainment, or to noise. Context has always been central to the definition of these kinds of settings. And in the case of the library, the context of the book on the bookshelf or of the bookshelf in the aisle, the context of the community of on-site experts and fellow readers, the context of the room and its furnishings, all of those kinds of context, and most of all, of course, the building itself as providing context, as a temple of learning, as a civic hub, as a place of communion between the living and the dead. So this brings me to the core question that cold storage takes on. What happens when we give up the need for contextual intelligibility and rely upon databases to do the work of relational ordering? What if we were to build entire physical architectures around the ubiquity of database architectures? These might seem like far-fetched notions, but they are already with us in the form of building types, like the Amazon distribution warehouse. And I thought I had a slide here of it, but no, I don't seem to. Oh, too bad. I don't know if any of you ever seen what an Amazon distribution warehouse looks like, but it's a rather staggering reality. Well, it went away. What's interesting about the Amazon warehouse model is that Amazon warehouses are built using what's called the chaotic storage system. It's a chaotic storage system means it's a system for ordering material that does not use taxonomies of the kind of categorical sort of like an object belongs to this category or that. Food is mixed with books, is mixed with appliances, but it's the mind of the database that puts those all together. So the object of cold storage, we're looking here at what you could argue is a kind of predecessor. And libraries, I think, have really pioneered this answer. Many answers, different answers to the question that I was raising right from the start here, which is this weaving together of the database with a physical structure. And this very unpromising structure that you're looking at here is called the Harvard Depository. It is literally the heart of the Harvard library system, a system of 90 libraries where the great majority of books are held in this facility, which is a pure storage facility that holds close to 10 million books and documents, in addition to which there are a variety of other kinds of media materials. And it's that story that cold storage is aiming to tell. And as you can see, the site of the book depository, if you look up here, is on a campus, a kind of guarded compound, about 45 minutes from Cambridge. So it's in the outskirts of the city of Boston, in a very interesting, kind of curious location. Not only is it guarded, but in the middle of that map that you see there, there is Harvard's primate lab, the lab that works with chimpanzees and other large primates, which is under regular political pressure from animal activists. So therefore, the books are under special kind of protection, in part because they're in the vicinity of a collection of animals who have been gathered for purposes of scientific experimentation. So what is cold storage, again, to recapitulate? It's the coda to an experimental book that itself was shaped by Library Test Kitchen. It's a database documentary that's in progress, that was developed in a design studio, and it's a documentary film that reprises the Alain Resnais film, but with the Harvard Depository as a kind of model of what a library is or can be, taking the place of the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris. So let's start with the book. So the Library Beyond the Book, which is a book that my colleague Matthew Battles and I published earlier this year, is a book that's really an attempt to try to reimagine what a print artifact can do in the context of this multi-channel reality that increasingly has shaped fields of learning today. So unlike a conventional scholarly book, it has a number of features. One of them that it's in 4 colors, and that color and design, in a sense, drive much of what the book consists in. It's a book that uses graphical elements as a key feature of the way it makes arguments. And that includes a deep interweaving of the visual with the verbal, but also certain kinds of plays from the playbook of experimental paperbacks of the late 1960s, like Marshall McLuhan's Medium is the Massage, with text that runs in different directions. As you can see, the provocations run vertically along the edge of the text so that you can actually read it. There are different forms of attention that this allows. Instead of just having a long scholarly argument, which it does have, that's the core of it, which is an essay that I'll say something about in a minute, you can also dive into the book with a much shallower kind of browsing, fast reading mentality, like a kind of grazing mentality. You can actually play the provocations like a flip book as well, if you're so inclined. Another feature is that the page types change. I've always wanted to publish a scholarly book with a cartoon as the preface, and I finally fulfilled my dream. It actually begins with a cartoon that imagines Melville Dewey, who is the founder of the Dewey Decimal System, going on a time journey through the different ways in which the library has changed. There are pages that are micro arguments inserted into the larger argument that are, in a sense, archaeologies of specific elements, like the bookshelf. There are the provocations, which also make up the card deck. These provocations are real propositions for elements of future libraries that could be combined, reimagined, recombined. And then, finally, there's cold storage, which is a rough draft of the script of the film that I'm going to conclude with here. It's an essay, a coda about the future of libraries that is dedicated to describing the Harvard depository. The core essay of the book consists in 6 scenarios for the future of libraries that look deep into the past of libraries, what libraries have been, and then think forward about what libraries could become under the kinds of conditions that characterize the digital era. And this is the full page layout of that final essay that you're about to see transformed into a documentary. The webdoc uses the floor plan of the structure to tell a story about these various contents that document its history. It's the history of its interaction with users, the way in which workers engage with it, the data flows in and out. The depository, like many such depositories like the one at Oxford, is a scanning station. So works both go physically from the place back to a larger network of users and libraries, but they also are produced as digital artifacts that are sent, sometimes duplicating what's in the collections. And we spend a lot of time producing visualizations, working with the data that are produced in the depository itself. And we also do archival work about its history. You can see that the Bibliothèque Nationale de France wrote to Harvard when it created its depository, asking all kinds of questions, technical questions about the techniques being employed to classify different kinds of documents, the kind of climatic conditions and so forth. And there's student works that try to both document aspects of the environment. In this case, this is a project by an architecture student that creates a kind of playable soundtrack where you can go in and listen to different elements, a kind of acoustical alphabet of what makes up the depository. I'm not sure if you can hear these, but it's a whole alphabet of different sounds located in the space of the depository. And there's a number of these projects. Some of them are creative projects that take documentary elements and then remix them and transform them. Others are straight kind of research projects, and so on and so forth. Now I'm going to close here. We can now turn to run the first clip, and I'm going to show you the opening sequence of the film and then just say a few words and show you a very rough cut of the final sequence of the film. So we can switch to running the film up there.
The Harvard University library system contains over 90 libraries. However, these libraries do not have adequate shelf space. Many of the materials in our collection, especially the more fragile ones, may have a shortened lifespan. To deal with the overflow and to provide a secure, climate-controlled environment, Harvard University has built a remote storage facility, the Harvard Depository.
Parce que leur mémoire est courte, les hommes accumulent d'innombrables pense-bêtes.
Because their memory is short-lived, humans accumulate an infinity of memory aids. Confronted with the teeming depositories that result, panic sets in. They fear being trampled by information, submerged beneath heaps of words and data. So to ensure their freedom, They erect formidable fortresses, faraway stockhouses, libraries that can't be read except by machine minds. One such bastion is a high-density facility known as the Harvard Depository, or HD, wherein reside 9 million books, pamphlets, posters, papers, films, magnetic tapes, photographs, LPs, and microforms. 9 million items and counting.
Ben counting. 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
With its 127,000 square feet of storage and 3 million linear feet of shelving, the HD represents the heart of the Harvard University library system.
So when I tell people about the environment that I work in, I try to say that it's mostly like that end scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark when they load up the Ark into the crate and they're nailing it shut and wrapping it up, and they start to push it down to the aisle into storage, and as he's going down the aisle it pans out and you see it's just bigger and bigger, and it just kind of keeps going on like here down the aisles, and how vast it really is.
It is, however, a dislocated heart. Invisible to patrons, it is situated 25 miles from campus atop a remote hill within a guarded compound near Harvard's primate labs. The HD is an analog server farm, comparable to the digital server farms the university maintains in other off-site locations, except for the fact that it mostly delivers physical packets of information via a pipeline of vans that shuttle back and forth to campus 4 times a day at approximately 60 miles per hour, more than 11 million times slower than the speed traveled by digital packets. But long before the advent of digital storage, libraries contended with the challenge of keeping too much information in too little space. Built in 1986, the HD's origins stretch back to the turn of the 20th century, when Harvard's president, Charles William Eliot, first began advocating not for a crematorium for dead books, but only a receiving tomb. Neither am I proposing that the bibliophile or the antiquarian should be deprived of his idols, wrote Eliot, only that his access to them should be made less convenient and attractive.
If it was a dark archive, it would be a lot less expensive because the whole transaction piece of it, the circulating and moving material back and forth and replacing it in its proper place would be eliminated for the most part, or at least diminished. As it stands, we do circulate probably about 250,000 items a year. Over the years, because of the trend towards electronic books and electronic journals, the percentage of the collection that gets used is declining, but the collection continues to grow.
From the outside, the HD is a faceless emplacement of corrugated concrete, flanked by ramparts of serpentine air ducts. 7 storage modules have been built to date. 8 additional slots remain available to accommodate the continuation of the human record. To avoid bursting at its seams, the HD neither digs deeper into the soil nor reaches higher into the heavens. It sprawls.
It's a much balder hilltop than it used to be. Every module displaces quarter acre, half acre of trees. Fire code keeps them back from the building by a certain distance. It's still quiet though. When I rode in this morning, there was a bunch of those big turkeys, skulking around people's cars.
Like other time capsules of its kind, the depository sets out to subjugate time as it compresses space. The vault must remain sealed, except when a tug on the pull chain opens up a momentary passage between time and eternity. Decay must be held at bay. Even if some works will be consulted only once, they must be preserved. That's the rule. A massive cooling system maintains an average of 50 degrees Fahrenheit with 35% average humidity, a dynamic balance responsive to seasonal change. Paper, leather, and parchment are living materials, aging whether we're reading them or not. In the darkened bay inhabited by film and video collections, the air is even colder. For while we experience these media as unchanging records of moments, their emulsions and magnetized surfaces are continually overridden by time. And now I'm going to show you just a concluding clip, which is just a rough cut of the end of the documentary. So, at night, the HD is freed from the distractions inflicted by the data devourer's proxies. As soon as they complete their appointed rounds, the decisive light switch is thrown, the last security code entered. The hum of surveillance cameras and cooling fans recedes into the background. There's a ripple through the door as it settles in place. The vault is sealed tight. An epiphany can be delayed no more. Two competing tales are told about the event that is believed to transpire every evening at midnight, even if unheard by mortal ears and unseen by mortal eyes. According to some, a deafening silence reigns in the midst of a sublime spectacle of universal immobility. Books rub up against other books, typefaces touch in secret, imperceptible conversations are carried on across the shelves and across the centuries that deride the petty illusions of the living. Molecular mutations gnaw away at monuments of celluloid and cellulose that have successfully stood every test that time has thrust their way. According to others, music erupts, the celestial song of millions of works, recorded in every medium, in every language, in every country that has ever existed. The chorus of physics, art, anatomy, history, theology, philosophy, poetics, the social sciences, and engineering. An era is prefigured when every enigma will have been solved, when every key to this universe or universes to come will have been handed over. An era sure to be forever postponed. Our collective ark, filled with petabyte upon petabyte of memories, sets sail on the sea of time. Humankind's noblest endeavor. Oblivion is the destination. Thank you. Yeah, sure. For those of you who, pour ceux qui n'ont pas la mémoire de toute la mémoire du monde fraîche en tête, il y a même dans ces séquences que j'ai fait visionner plusieurs ou reprises ou réinterprétations ou même modifications de scènes qui appartiennent au film de René.
Both presentation as well, theory and practice, shall we say, between knowledge production and design. But first, any questions, reactions, observations from, please.
Sorry, I missed the beginning, but I have a question about...
1 second for the micro. Please. Yes.
So, I missed the beginning, so I don't have the full picture.
Yes, very much so. And unfortunately, what I was able to show you is just a small set of scenes from the film. But so like many storage facilities, and indeed many actual more traditional libraries that are built around visitors, not around retrieval or database systems, the depository produces vast amounts of data and digital documents alongside with gathering and making accessible analog objects. And often there's an overlap between those two. So the scanning stations, which are these robotic high-volume scanning stations, are actually part of the film at a different place. And in fact, in that sequence in the film, we deliberately rewrite, unless you really know the René inside out, you wouldn't know this, but the actual, the voiceover, the score, is actually made out of a collage of quotations that have been reworked from the René script, which was written by Renaud Furlani. So yeah, I mean, it's really an attempt, the film is an attempt to tell a contemporary story that's still historical, like the René, about what libraries had already been becoming starting in the mid-1980s when databases started taking over as the access points, as the mind that holds together systems. And to try to really reinforce the suggestion that that in a sense the history of these modern warehousing and storage facilities like Amazon warehouses has a deep history that's very connected to this even pre-digital era of sort of knowledge architectures that libraries are a particularly acute expression of. So yes, we do deal with that, particularly in the web doc. The web doc, which surrounds the documentary that you saw, includes a lot of material about the way that information systems flow in and out of the depository, alongside the flows of print objects, and the way they intersect one another especially.
Other questions?
Hello. You were talking about end-user trajectories and how documentaries can be imagined in a way that individuals can navigate their own way through and create their own end pieces. Is this again something that through the web doc you've explored a bit more fully and will be released? As I was quite interested in how you actually go about doing that in a practical sense and how you get to that post-taxonomic kind of state, because it obviously throws up multiple challenges of how you get beyond taxonomies and metadata in a way that allows that flexibility of navigation.
Right, yeah, and that is really the challenge with a forum, a kind of open forum like the web documentary, the database documentary, to create a structure that is just a pure accumulation of representations, documents, artifacts, of course does very little. It doesn't create a rich set of potential experiences for end users. And then to create a completely scripted and linear path, which is the traditional documentary form, of course, fails on other counts. It throws so much really rich information onto the cutting floor. So the real challenge with these kinds of open forms is to find a kind of happy intersection, a kind of, even with frictions and with tensions, between storytelling in the directed, top-down way and bottom-up content production. And that's the challenge that we're trying to work with through this kind of multi-channel publication approach, in the sense that we think there are ways, and that's sort of how also my approach, by the way, to the remediation of print, which I mentioned in terms of this book. This is a book that's built around a traditional form of scholarly or historical argument, which is the long essay. It has an essay that goes from the beginning of the book pretty much to the end of it. But then it plays with merging that essay with short forms of argument at a kind of micro, fine-grained level, and trying to find the way that you can balance those two spaces of expression, of like knowledge presentation, is very analogous to this problem that you were bringing up in your question about how we make the web doc not a confusing kind of mess of materials, but rather a place where there are already some paths that have been scripted that already kind of lead you by the hand certain places, and yet where there's this opening for the unexpected, for the surprising, for juxtapositions that are productive. And so I think the real challenge of designing web docs is precisely that. It's how to create a rich enough set of, a library of materials, an archive, so to speak, but how to animate that archive in ways that some of those stories are already told, and others are told in fragments, and others are not told at all. And there's enough of a kind of map, enough of a set of guidelines, enough of a set of narratives to make it a rich experience as a point of departure that then becomes the basis on which wandering can take place. And it's a genre that there's plenty of good examples of failures, and there's plenty of bad examples of successes because they go too far on one side or too far on the other side. And it's very much a genre in progress, and if I didn't say so explicitly, I probably should have, that my interest in the so-called digital humanities is really in digital humanities as a space of experimentation. And so experimentation with these hybrid genres, for me, is right at the core of the part that interests me the most. So by knowledge design, I'm thinking about exactly those kinds of challenges that are really, design challenges. They're also storytelling challenges. How do we rethink the, practices of scholarly argument writing in ways that could embed within these structures that work on multiple scales? And of course, that increases the complexity of the challenges that one faces. But the flip side of that is that these kinds of projects can speak to audiences that will never pick up a scholarly monograph or a specialized journal. And that interests me a great deal.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I have a missing link between what you have said and what I was imagining a knowledge, what is it? Let me find the
Design.
No, not knowledge design, the object that you were, the database documentary?
Yes.
No. Yes, right, thank you. Your point that knowledge now is more process and a product. So, and what we have seen, of course, we have seen only the film and not what is in the book. So I'm missing part of it. But for me, the film was interesting, but it was how a physical repository functions and the challenge of that. So I'm really missing the link with your talk. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, the process piece is, in a sense, I guess I would argue what holds together all these very different kinds of in a sense, there are products involved. Like maybe I could answer your question by going back to the example of the book, for instance. So this, usually when you think of print, it's the traditional expectation is this is the end of a research process. And when it reaches the moment of print and it goes out into the world and it goes into the storage systems, that's where the production cycle, in a sense, stops and a new cycle begins, which is the cycle of reception, of reading, of reaction in the community of people with expert knowledge. That is not the case with this book in the sense that not only does it have these extensions that are being built over time and added to continuously, in the case of the web doc, we'll probably continue to have probably even some live elements where you actually see things that are happening in real time. As part of the documentation stream, as well as materials that are historical and archival and so forth that go back to 1986 and beyond. So it's not so much the giving up of product per se, it's the reframing of different kinds of moments of product in a stream that now has this kind of complexity of being woven together, including elements that are themselves expansible, modifiable, that are not fixed, in other words. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question you're asking, but... Yeah.
I don't know if I'm allowed a follow-on question or not. Because isn't it the perspective issue that when only the producer of the book thought that this was an endpoint, so it has always been obvious for users and learners that it was not an endpoint. So is it about a different representation of the producer of knowledge or a different representation of knowledge itself?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's both, and your point is absolutely well taken. This fiction that the book, in a sense, ends the act of meaning creation, of course, is convenient maybe for copyright law, but but the reality of how books are handled, they become parts of people's lives. The way that we read is also a reality that's much more fluid and dynamic, as you suggest. But I think where the meshing together of the digital and the analog pieces of a project like this become interesting is precisely in this space where processes that are about interpretation or reading or the afterlife, if you like, of moments in that process become integrated into that process. Which is to say that because a website or a database documentary can be constantly added to and modified, and contents that are produced as part of the environment itself can become integrated into the archive, so to speak. It creates a different dynamic, I think, and it's a much more fluid dynamic where not only is there a kind of bottom-up that accompanies the traditional top-down models of communication, but there's also a kind of set of friction points across those different encounters. And to me, that's still a space where, without giving up certain truth standards and standards about evidence and argument, we can explore the possibilities of opening the door to a more participatory models of culture or bottom-up type models. And this is an area we've worked on in a whole range of projects at MetaLab. The principal one has to do with liberating essentially the data assets of museum collections data and engaging communities of non-experts in not just crowdsourcing of objects, but also thinking about modes of narrative analysis argument that complement ones that are coming from the holder institutions and dialogue with them. So it's a question of, I think, staging these experiments. I don't think that they're necessarily the point of arrival. I think there's a lot of pieces that have to be filled in. Maybe you're touching upon some of those.
Any more questions? No.
Yeah, I didn't want to monopolize, but then I have another one, if I can. Well, some who were there this morning know I am very fond of Hannah Arendt thinking. And what she says about the public and the world we have in common is that it is what precisely can be seen from different perspectives. So hearing, and I've not seen your book yet, but yeah, I've seen it in fact, but not...
You've seen it.
Read it. Isn't it that this object, as an object, is like the public or the common, that it is precisely something to be grasped, can be seen from different perspectives? And then how do you link the knowledge and the fact that it can be grasped from different perspectives? So this sort of bundling of relative perspectival on truth. And yeah, this.
Well, one of the things this book tries to do is it's a book about the future of libraries, not written either by architects or by librarians, but rather by historians, but who are engaged in essentially a historically grounded series of design propositions. I mean, that's the sort of focus of the argument that it makes. So it takes seriously the notion of excavating pieces from the history of the library as an institution in order to build a series of scenarios for future scenarios. And the card deck, the provocations, those other layers that are laid on top of the historical kind of the ground, if you like, the extended essay, the argument about those 6 scenarios, are deliberately addressed to audiences who are involved in decision making. So one of the things that we're really interested in is this idea that this is a book that can be used as a game, like the cards can be used as a game, for people in conversations that are usually very circular conversations about, should we do this or should we do that? Does a library still have reference works at the center of it? To really change the kind of framing of the kind of fundamental questions that are asked in those conversations. It's a very practical, I guess what I'm trying to say, very practical set of questions, linked also to trying to address the design community, communities of people who have to answer the question of what does a smart space look like? What have smart spaces looked like, for centuries? So to create this, in other words, a kind of small portfolio of target audiences, but within a larger container that can still speak to cultural historians, to just curious people, to interested people, to people who like comics about Melville Dewey, to try to create, in other words, a kind of, again, a balance between the need for long and sustained argument and engagement with the historical record, and something that looks a little bit more playful than a conventional scholarly exposition, and therefore they can speak in multiple languages. And so the media components are, in a sense, part of that kind of multiple language setting. And once again, it's a balancing act. It's a balancing act, but it is trying to give the scholarly book a kind of a sort of glamour and sex appeal that it hasn't had. And it's certainly, scholarly books have looked pretty much the same for 150 years. I don't think it's premature to think that we could start to redesign them and think about design features as integral features of contemporary models of scholarly argument. So it's a hybrid, I guess, is what I would say.
If there are no more questions, we will thank Jeff very, very much for a wonderful talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you.